Hi students, in these notes we will be learning how to use the quadratic formula. First off, remember that f of x equals ax squared plus bx plus c is the standard form for a quadratic function. What actually makes it quadratic is this exponent of 2. Okay? So if you see that on your variable as an exponent, then you've got a quadratic function. I want you to also remember that the f of x is the same as y, or your output, so you may also see it like this, a quadratic function. Also remember, well, not remember, but if the output equals 0, then that is where your graph crosses the x-axis. So when y has a value of 0, if I was to somehow figure out how to solve this equation for the value of x, that would actually give me my solutions. So if you recall, whenever we graph a quadratic function, we create a parabola, that U shape. When I graph it, it can look one of 3 ways. It can intersect the x-axis at 2 points. It can intersect the x-axis, it's not very good, let's say that intersects at 1 point, or it can be completely above or below the x-axis and not intersected at all. If I was to solve this equation right here for the value of x, that's going to give me the values of these x-intercepts. I want you to also remember that x-intercepts are also known as some other words as well. X-intercepts, we also call these the zeros. We also call these the roots. And we also call these the solutions. And you've got to know that these 4 terms are interchangeable. Those are where your graph crosses the x-axis. So what we're going to learn is a formula that kind of helps us find those values of where it crosses. I'm going to show you how that works. So if I wanted to find these values, this is how the quadratic formula works. In your equation, a, b, and c, these are actually going to be numbers or values. So you're going to identify those first, and then you're going to plug it into this formula. X, that's the value we're trying to find, or the values if there's 2 solutions, or there's not a solution at all, equals negative b, or the opposite of b's value, plus or minus, which I'll talk about that weird symbol, the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. Please write this down. We're going to be using this for the next 4 examples so you can see how this works. But go ahead and write this down. You may want to also write down the standard form for a quadratic function as well, so you can remember where the a, b, and the c come from. Here's our first example. Use the quadratic formula to find the roots. Remember, roots are zeros, x-intercept solutions of this function. F of x equals 3x squared minus 8x plus 4. So the very first thing we want to do is identify our a, our b, and our c. The a is the number in front of x squared. The b is the number in front of x. If there's a minus or a negative in front, that is also part of that value of that letter. So there's b. And then the constant at the end, that's going to be your c. Make sure you get the signs correct. Next, we're going to go ahead and recall what our quadratic formula is. X equals negative b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac. This is a formula, all over 2a. This is a formula that hopefully you'll use it enough that it'll start to kind of sink in your head. You don't want to have to look this up each time, so try to slowly be memorizing this formula. So now we're going to go ahead and plug in the numbers into the correct spot. So negative b is first. Since our b is negative 8, negative b would be the opposite of negative 8, which would be positive 8. So that's the first thing we want to get right. Plus or minus, square root. The next thing, b squared. If your b is negative, especially make sure you put it in parentheses. So our b is negative 8, and then we're going to square that in a second. Right now we're just plugging in the numbers, and then we'll simplify. I'm going to point out some things while we simplify that are common mistakes that students make so that you don't make those same mistakes. This is one of them. If your b is negative, definitely put it in parentheses when you square it. If you were to put that in your calculator without the parentheses, it'll give you the wrong answer. All right, let's keep going. Minus 4 times A is 3, times C is 4. So we'll multiply all that out in a minute. And this is all over 2 times my value of A, which is 3. Now I will tell you that a lot of students, without thinking, not intentionally, forget the denominator part of this formula. So just be really careful, make sure you're getting all the pieces. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and simplify. I'm going to kind of come up here. So we're simplifying for x. So we've got 8 plus or minus. Let's simplify what's inside the square root symbol. Negative 8 squared is negative 8 times negative 8, which is positive 64. And then let's go ahead and multiply negative 4 times 3 times positive 4, and that is negative 48. And remember, this is all over the 2 times 3, which is 6. So we're going to keep simplifying. We've got the 8 plus or minus. 64 minus 48 is 16, so square root of 16 all over 6. And then the last thing we can keep doing to simplify is the square root of 16. Luckily, 16 is a perfect square. I can figure out what the square root of that is. Remember, you're trying to figure out what times itself equals that number, and it would be 4. So 8 plus or minus 4. Remember, when you take the square root of a number, the square root symbol is gone, and this is all over 6. All right, so here's where we're finally going to get to the plus or minus symbol. That's the very last thing you do. Basically what that means is I'm going to evaluate this whole thing 2 times. I'm going to evaluate once using a plus and once again using a minus, and that's going to give me 2 different answers. So I'm going to have 8 plus 4 divided by 6, and we're going to also have 8 minus 4 divided by 6. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and erase some of this. Okay, let's go ahead and keep simplifying. So 8 plus 4 is 12, and 12 divided by 6 is 2. There's one solution. Over here for the other solution, 8 minus 4 is 4, and 4 over 6 simplifies to 2/3. There's the other solution. So there are 2 solutions. So for this particular, if I relate it back to the graph, and I don't know exactly what the graph looks like, but I do know that my parabola crosses at 2/3 and 2. So if that's 1 and 2, it's going to cross right here at 2, and then 2/3 is a little bit before the 1, so the parabola could look something like this. Next example. Use the quadratic formula to find the zeros of the function. Remember, zeros means roots, solutions, x-intercepts. This is where we want to use the quadratic formula. So let's take a look at our function here. We need to identify a, b, and c. A is the number in front of x squared, and since I don't see a number, I know that there's always a 1 right there. So a equals 1. B is the number in front of x. That's going to be positive 10. And C is your constant at the end, which is a negative 5. Make sure you get those signs correct. Now we're going to write down the quadratic formula again. X equals negative b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over, don't forget, 2a. Let's go ahead and plug in all the numbers. Negative b is opposite b, so since our b is positive 10, we're going to put negative 10. Plus or minus square root of b squared is going to be 10 squared, and since 10 is positive, I don't have to put it in parentheses. I could. It's not going to make a big deal if I don't. Minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, which is negative 5. And this is all over 2 times a, which is 1. So let's go ahead and simplify this. I'm going to try to do a better job of organizing my space. So we've got negative 10 plus or minus square root of 10 squared is 10 times 10, which is 100. Negative 4 times 1 times negative 5 is going to be positive 20. And this is all over 2 times 1, which is 2. All right, I'm going to go back up here. Now we're going to simplify what's in the square root symbol. 100 plus 20 is 120. So now we've got negative 10 plus or minus square root of 120 all over 2. Okay, so now we're ready to take the square root of 120. In the last example, it was square root of 16, which is a perfect square, which is 4, because 4 times 4 is 16. Here, there's not a number times itself that equals 120. That even comes to mind. So since 120 is not what we would call a perfect square, this is where we're going to use our calculator. Later on, you will learn how to simplify square roots. For now, if it's not a perfect square, you're just going to type it into your calculator. So let's go ahead. We're going to evaluate this once with a plus and once with a minus. So we've got negative 10 plus the square root of 120 over 2. And then we also have, I'm running out of room, negative 10 minus the square root of 120 over 2. So we're going to simplify both of these. So when you put it in your calculator, you will get a decimal answer, and we're going to just so we're all on the same page, round to 2 decimal places. So when I type in negative 10 plus square root of 120 over 2, when I round that, we get, I'm going to use the wiggly equal sign. The wiggly equal signs means we're rounding, or it's an approximation, and I did not like those. We're going to get about, when rounded, 0.48. So there is one solution. And then for the other one, when we put it in, if we round it, it's going to be about negative 10.48. Okay, so these are my 2 solutions. I could also think of these, since they are solutions or x-intercepts, I could also write any of these answers as an ordered pair as well. It kind of just depends what is being asked. So if I was to write this as an ordered pair, one point would be 0.48 comma 0, because remember this is where y is 0, and the other one would be negative 10.48 comma 0. And so if I was to graph this, my positive 0.48 solution would be over here somewhere, my negative 10.48 solution would be over here somewhere, and my graph might look something like that. This example says use the quadratic formula to solve the equation. So remember, whenever you solve, that's the verb of the noun solution. So you're finding the solutions, the x-intercepts, zeros, roots. I want you to notice how each example is being asked a little bit differently. This example doesn't have the f of x or y right here. It actually is a 0. So there isn't another variable in this equation. So it doesn't look like it's in function notation necessarily. So in this case, you would just say solve the equation. And we haven't learned how to solve quadratic equations yet. That's going to be the next part. So for right now, we're using the quadratic formula. But we do have 0 on one side, which is kind of like the value of y for my solution, so it makes sense. The right side of the equation is in standard form of a quadratic, so we can pull out our a, our b, and our c. The a, remember, is in front of x squared. Since there's not a number there, we can call it 1. The b is in front of x, it's -6, and the c is the constant at the end, so it's 9. Let's go ahead and write down our quadratic formula. X equals -b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And let's plug in our numbers. -b is opposite of b. Our b is -6, so the opposite of a -6 is +6. Plus or minus square root b squared, so because our b is negative, definitely make sure you put it in parentheses, -6 squared minus 4 times our a of 1 times our c of 9, all over 2 times our a of 1. So we've got everything plugged in. Let's go ahead and simplify. I always simplify with simplifying what's under the square root first. So -6 squared is -6 times -6, which is +36. So we're going to bring down the 6 and the plus or minus, square root. -6 squared we just said was 36. -4 times 1 times 9 is -36, or -36, all over 2 times 1, which is 2. All right, go ahead and go up here. Okay, so let's keep simplifying. 36 minus 36 is 0. So we've got 6 plus or minus square root of 0 over 2. Now the square root of 0 is 0. So this is basically 6 plus or minus 0 over 2. And now we're going to go ahead and split it up. But watch what's going to happen. 6 plus 0 over 2. And 6 minus 0 over 2. Well, 6 plus 0 is 6, and 6 minus 0 is 6. So basically, these are the same thing. They both simplify to 6 over 2. I need to be putting my equal signs here, which equals 3. So this is an example of where our x-intercept, or where we only have one x-intercept. So on my graph, my x-intercept is at 3, 0, and my parabola is just going to touch the x-axis right there at just that one point. It's not going to intersect it twice. So this is what would happen if we only had one solution. What usually happens is there's a 0 under the square root symbol. So that's just what happens in that case. And this is the last example. Thanks for staying with me. Use the quadratic formula to find the solutions, roots, zeros, x-intercepts of the function. It looks like it's in, ax squared plus bx plus c form, so we're going to identify our a, b, and c. A is the number in front of x squared, so that's 2. B is the number in front of x, so that's +3. C is the number at the end, so that's +6. Let's go ahead and write down our quadratic formula. -b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Let's plug in our numbers. -b is opposite b, so since our b is 3, we're going to put -3. -3 plus or minus b squared is 3 squared minus 4 times a, which is 2, times c, which is 6, all over 2 times a, which is 2. Let's go ahead and simplify under the square root symbol. So bring down the -3 plus or minus. 3 squared is 9. -4 times 2 times 6 is, let's see, -48. And this is all over 2 times 2, which is 4. Let's go up here and see if we can't simplify it. -3 plus or minus 9 minus 48 is -39. And then this is all over 4. All right, so here's another scenario. This is the last scenario you might encounter. And this is really important that you pay attention. If the number under the square root symbol is negative, like this negative 39, you cannot take the square root of it. You cannot take the square root of a negative number. Nothing times itself equals a negative number. Negative times negative is positive. Positive times positive is positive. So, in this case, there is no solution. So this is the other kind of scenario you might encounter. And all no solution means is that on our graph, our parabola is just either completely above our x-axis or completely below. It doesn't ever touch the x-axis. So, go back, write down that quadratic formula, know how to use it, practice. Go do the practices that are provided in Canvas, and then when you're ready, take a quiz. Let me know if you guys need any help. Make sure that you're coming to the Zoom meetings on Thursday morning if you need any help with this. Bye, good luck.